In his video, Atheism and Negative Theology, Professor Anton argues for a negative theological approach to religious and spiritual discourse. A link to his video can be found in the underbar. He makes the following statements, and I'm quoting him exactly. You can't really say what God is. You can't talk about God. It's beyond anything that could be said. Consider now the kinds of propositions which make ontological claims, however oblique, about which nothing can be said. They are propositions that convey impossibilities. Consider propositions about square circles, for example. You can truthfully say, you can't really say what a square circle is, and all we've done is replace God with square circle. And the reason you can't is because a square circle is an impossibility. I am not sure how negative theological propositions can make claims of ontological significance if they are part of the class of propositions whose claims convey ontological impossibilities. But I am less interested in the class that negative theological propositions share than I am in the rhetorical effect of negative theology upon discussions about spiritual ontological claims. Now, I want to say at the outset that I do not think that those who embrace a negative theological approach have adopted a rhetorical strategy to make an examination of their claims immune to criticism. I believe their negative theological approach is motivated by a sincere reverential posture that doesn't want to limit the divine by any propositions that could be made about it. Nevertheless, the rhetorical effect of a negative theological approach makes religious claims immune to criticism. If nothing affirmative could be said about the divine's ontological status, well, it follows that nothing could be said against it. Notice how that works out rather conveniently for the believer. They get to continue to suggest and hint that the divine has some vague but ultimately ineffable ontological status without facing any serious critique of the statements made about the divine's ontological status. Of course, the embarrassing and damning upshot for the believer who takes the negative theological approach is you can't really say anything for some X that you can't, at least in principle, say against some X. A negative theological approach reduces the propositions about the divine and God to gibberish. Another rhetorical effect of the negative theological approach is that it relieves the believer from the obligation of grounding his elusive propositions about the divine in sound evidence. If propositions based on evidence about the divine are necessarily limiting and therefore misleading, then the believer is relieved of the task of producing sound evidence to support their proposition. That also works out rather conveniently for the believer. When atheists and skeptics point out the paucity of sound evidence for a God or the divine, the believer can simply beg off the criticism by saying, "This is not about evidence. Evidentiary claims are too limiting." Of course, that also means that the believer's assent to a system of beliefs for which there is no sound evidence is very much in evidence. I consider that intellectually irresponsible. Professor Anton said in his video about the ineffability of divine speech, and I quote, "There is no possible way to talk and take yourself seriously about the divine," end of quote. And I say that is precisely the problem with the negative theological approach. If you can't take yourself seriously when you take a negative theological approach, why take a negative theological approach seriously at all? Thank you.